In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only Total War. Big Daddy Emps has been enshrined on the golden toilet seat of Terra for more than 10,000 years, and the Great Rift has torn the Imperium of Man in half. There is no peace amongst the stars, only an eternity of carnage and slaughter, and the laughter of thirsting gods. I want to talk to you guys about something today, something that's been on the mind of countless people since Total War Warhammer was first announced almost 4 years ago, and that is the possibility of a Total War game set in the 40k universe. A universe filled to the brim with heresy, with Xenos, with a whole lot of grimdark, and violence on an unimaginable scale. Let's be honest, 40k is a natural follow-up and extension of what's already been created for the Total War Warhammer trilogy. Many of the assets and ideas that were implemented could be carried over one-to-one with minimal changes, or at the very least provide the framework and evidence that says, hey, this could totally work in a Total War game. The Greenskins, the Demons of Chaos, Bombardments, Psychers, Constructs, and Walkers, the list goes on and on. It has the potential to be the best-selling Total War game of all time, bar none, and 40k has a gigantic fan base that could be brought into the Total War sphere. And while I'd argue Warhammer Fantasy has more heart and is more personal, in my opinion there's more room to advance the overarching story in 40k, because it's on a much grander scale. Obviously we saw that issue with the narrative of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. If Karl Franz and the Empire lose their war against Archaon the Everchosen, you get the end times. The setting blows up, sucked into a demonic black hole under Middenheim. So if you don't want to end the setting, it kind of has to be stuck in a perpetual stalemate in fantasy. Not so with 40k. The forces of chaos and the Tyranids and all the major threats to the galaxy have much more room to flex their muscles, to strike fear into the heart of the Imperium, to destroy thousands of planets and kill billions of innocents, but the setting won't just end if they win a major war. There's also a gaping maw the size of the Eye of Terror left open in the market where Dawn of War 3 crashed and burned, and given Creative Assembly's close relationship with Games Workshop, and the fact that they've done, frankly, an amazing job with the Total War Warhammer series, creating by far the most richly fleshed out world with the most content of any Warhammer game ever, they could take the reins at any point. But Warhammer 40,000 presents some pretty massive challenges as well, obviously. I mean, the Total War team over at CA have never made a science fantasy game before, ever. Squad-based tactics, vehicular combat, and levels of technology that far surpass anything we've ever seen in the Total War Warhammer series before would all have to leave their mark. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Sure, their studio has made games like Halo Wars, a top-down RTS, but that is worlds apart from what we should expect from combat and campaign gameplay in a Total War game. So the question I want to ask you guys today is, should Creative Assembly try and tackle the 40k universe? Should they use the blueprint they've already established with the Total War Warhammer series, and despite all the hurdles and all the difficulties in making a game that would be achingly familiar, but yet so alien to anything we've ever seen before, make a Total War game set in the 41st millennium? Well, I'm making this video, so you probably know what my answer is already. We could just say no, there's no way in hell they could do it, and maybe they can't. Maybe they don't want to. Although Ian Roxborough and the devs themselves have already come out on record and said they do, in fact, want to. But if we were to just write it off, I think we'd be sorely lacking in imagination. And this video would be very boring and very short. So I say, do it. And here are my ideas and the hurdles that will need to be cleared before we see the glorious 41st millennium grace our computer screens. First question is, where should it be set? There is 30k and the Fires of the Horus Heresy to consider. The narrative that kicked off pretty much everything in the 40k universe. Horus and the Luna Wolves, tricked by Erebus and Malagurst on Davin, poisoned by a sword blessed by Nurgle himself, falling to chaos and kicking off a galactic civil war that brought the Imperium to its knees, that saw 9 legions turn from the light of the Emperor, that saw Primarchs and demigods die, and saw Big Daddy Emps himself turn into a Skelly Boy and entomb within the Golden Throne for all of eternity. I'll be honest, as awesome as 30k would be, even it doesn't have the scope I'd like to be covered. Remember, Warhammer Fantasy already has a Total War trilogy more than halfway through its life cycle. By the end, we'll have every single major Warhammer Fantasy battle race, including the Ogre Kingdoms, the Chaos Dwarfs, the Demons of Chaos, and possibly even Kislev. Why not do the same thing for 40k? In fact, I'd argue it's the only way to do justice to 40k. It's much too big for one game. Yeah, we could see something like Dawn of War 3, start off with Space Marines, Eldar, and Orcs, and then maybe get 2 more factions as DLC, but consumers have already spoken on that issue. We want full rosters. We want all the playable races. We want tons of options for legendary lords, for customization. We want basically all the content we can possibly fit in the game. You cannot do all of that content in a single game. It's impossible. A trilogy with lots of well fleshed out DLC and generous free LC with continuous support and updates is the only way to tackle this setting and do it the full justice it deserves. The problem with 30k is that many of the most popular and iconic races make little to no impact whatsoever on its story. High Fleet Leviathan and the Tendrils of the Tyranids are nowhere to be seen at this point. The Tau are literally 5,000 years away from even entering their own Stone Age in the 31st millennium. The Necron tier remain dormant on their tomb worlds, and so on and so forth. Basically, if they did 30k, we don't get to see many of the most popular races, period. And the technology and assets wouldn't necessarily carry over so well in a trilogy either. Space Marine and Dreadnought armor, for example, changes pretty dramatically in terms of visuals in those 10,000 years. So if it's going to be a series of games, like a trilogy, like Total War Warhammer, why create a bunch of assets that would not be used in the year 999 of Millennium 41? So I don't think Horus Heresy is really on the table, maybe as a standalone expansion in some theoretical universe way down the line. What I do want to see, though, is the current timeline. I think that 40k lore right now is in a really epic spot. The story is actually advancing, finally. Phaelbadon and the 13th Black Crusade finally got something done and destroyed Cadia, leading the biggest chaos incursion in recent memory. An entire half of the Imperium Nihilus, has been completely darkened by the Cicatrix Maledictum, a warp storm that essentially cut the galaxy in half. The Primarch robot Girly Man has been awakened to lead his Mary Sue Marines and the Imperium into the long dark. An Eldar god that bears an uncanny resemblance to She Who Thirsts has been birthed, and Yvraine, the Vizarch, and the Avatar Incarnate are all representing Aeneid and the hopes of an entire species on the brink of extinction. Custodians, the bodyguards of the Emperor, have an updated army book that is sexy as hell, as do the Tau, the Necrons, the Death Guard, Adeptus Mechanicus, and many others. And the Ultramarines aren't the only dudes getting their Primarch back. Angren and the World Eaters, Lion and the Dark Angels, Fulgrim and the Emperor's Children, and others might be returning to the fold sooner rather than later. So basically, it's a really exciting time to be a 40k fan. And because the current conflict is galaxy spanning, the lore is galaxy spanning right now, introducing a ton of unique and interesting characters that honestly perfectly fit into the legendary Lord mold that's already been set out. It is also a perfect setting for a Total War game. Seriously, just take a moment with me, close your eyes, and imagine a game with Mortarion and the Death Shroud, and every other major Chaos Space Marine Legion and their Demon Prince leaders, with the Eldari, with the Drukhari, with every up-to-date 8th edition army book, all the units, all the vehicles, and the walkers, and the Xenos abominations, you name it. All part of one combined campaign. All of it at your fingertips. It is glorious to think about. It's the exact same thing as you would think about Total War Warhammer. You can get all of these crazy expensive models right there to play with at any time, and you don't have to spend $20,000 to be able to field an army for each of those factions. But one of the big questions is, how would the campaign map actually work? Well, obviously, it'd be a gigantic departure from anything we've ever seen before. I guess it is possible CA could go the Dawn of War route and shoehorn them all into a single planet with some lore blurb saying they're fighting over a galaxy-ending weapon or some special resource, but when you're talking about 15 major races or more, many of whom don't build traditional cities or fortifications in any way, shape, or form, I think that would kind of be a cop-out. So I think space, the final frontier, needs to be the campaign map itself, which obviously would be a big departure in and of itself. Something like this, a map of the Milky Way galaxy. Now, obviously, you'd want it to be much more animated, much prettier, and it would have much less content than this in terms of the actual planets, because obviously, you cannot recreate the entirety of the Imperium of Man-controlled space in a single video game. There's no way to do it, or even in a trilogy. It's not possible. There's way too many worlds and way too much space to cover. So, what could be done is take the most important zones of control, the 5 segmentum that make up the Imperium, and populate them each with a few of the most important planets in that area of the galaxy. A segmentum would function a lot like a continent does in traditional Total War games, like Naggaroth or Ulthuan. A system would be a portion of that continent, like the Badlands or the Old World. A sector would be a province, and the important planets within those sectors would be the settlements themselves. Take the Segmentum Obscurus, for example, home to the Cadian sector, the Scarus sector, and the Gothic sector. A sector would be made up of 3 or 4 planets, just like a province is made up of 3 or 4 settlements. The Cadian sector would host Cadia itself, Solar Macarius, and Caesar Partox, which would be the 3 planets within, and just like previous Total War games, each of those planets would be built up like a settlement to focus on something unique. You've got agro worlds for food, prison worlds for public order, naval training worlds for faster movement across the galaxy, industrial worlds, and military recruitment worlds. The Segmentum Solar would of course be home to Holy Terra, Mars, and Sol, seat of the Imperium's power. And you could basically build the entire galaxy to just house the planets and factions you deem appropriate. You wouldn't need to add every minor planet in the lore. Just the major important ones that house Space Marine chapters, like the Fortress Monastery at Ball for the Blood Angels, and that kind of stuff. Or Vigilus, site of the only confirmed passage to the Great Rift of Chaos into the Imperium Nihilus, one of the only remaining lifelines to the Dark Imperium that gives them access to the Astronomicon. So Game 1 might start out with only 1 or 2 segmentums, and slowly add more and more content, more planets, and more factions, until the best and brightest elements of 40k are all present and playable. But I think combat is what's really on everyone's mind. What elements of it would actually work well just right off the bat, and what would need some doing to get up to snuff? There's no question, formation combat has always been one of the main staples of the Total War franchise, the glue that has bound pretty much every game in the series in terms of combat. That would have to change. Not completely, but still a significant amount. Squad-based combat is a major obstacle because Space Marines aren't going to move and wheel in a nice big block formation. That's just not how they fight. They're going to behave more like individuals in terms of taking cover, spreading out, returning fire, and taking a position that allows them to maintain fire superiority. But just because it's never been done before in a Total War game doesn't mean CA can't innovate or that they can't actually implement those kind of mechanics. A cover system that allows units to actually interact with their environment would be a must without question. They need to be able to hunker down, to slam into rock formations or crouch down into trenches, to hide behind trees, and all of that kind of stuff. Really couldn't get away with units dedicated to range combat just standing out in the open like idiots, pretending like it's some 1700s line battle. Now, of course, that does exist quite a bit in the 40k universe. Remember, the rule of cool does kind of lord over everything else in 40k, so there are plenty of suicidal advances over open terrain in the lore, but cover needs to be represented. Perhaps maybe the Dawn of War 2 method of severely reducing enemy chance to hit when firing into heavy objects, and making a difference between heavy and light cover. Elevation changes, buildings, and especially urban warfare are core tenets of the whole concept as well. We actually have seen elements of this in games like Empire and Napoleon, where line units would be able to actually garrison buildings and fire out of them. But urban warfare is obviously taken to a whole new level in 40k. And if you really want to do it justice, destructibility is a huge factor. I mean, we're talking weapons that have the power to knock out entire tanks in a single shot, to burn entire regiments to ash in seconds. A stone building is not going to stand in the way of a Gauss cannon for very long, or God forbid, an orbital bombardment from on high. So I'm talking complete overhaul of map design. No longer will this battle map system of rolling hills with some scattered trees work. We've had it in Rome 2, we had it in Attila, we're probably going to have it in Three Kingdoms. We need a new battle map system. The maps need to be a lot more dynamic and interesting to actually accompany the introduction of a focus on ranged combat and the introduction of vehicles. Lots of buildings, lots of terrain features like creek beds, large rocks jutting out from the ground that you can actually take cover behind, cliffs, trenches, long sightlines that allow snipers and stuff to actually get their line of sight going, and other obstacles need to be commonplace to actually make this all work. And as I just mentioned, vehicular warfare is one of those confounding variables that would be really challenging and really satisfying to implement properly. This is a universe with gigantic battle tanks like the Leman Russ, like the Baneblade. You've got Rhinos, Razorbacks, Triarch Stalkers, Eldar Fire Prisms, Land Raider Redeemers, flying vehicles like the Tau Barracuda. The list goes on and on and on. And some of it would undoubtedly end up on the cutting room floor, I'm sure, but vehicles add an entirely new element of warfare that completely changes the game. You cannot have a 40k game without the firepower and mobility that vehicles will bring to bear. There are entire Space Marine chapters like the White Scars who dedicate the main body of their strike force to vehicular combat. For some of it, the Walkers especially, there are already fantastic elements to draw inspiration from. Certainly an Emperor Titan or a Warhound would look and move very differently than the Necrolith Colossi of the Vampire Coast roster, but the core elements are already there. They've already been proven to work and work well in the Total War sphere. I'm not worried about animations. Their animation team is incredibly talented. If CA can animate a Hellpit Abomination, they can animate anything. But size, scale, and balance of damage output on something as monstrous and robotic as an Imperator Titan will be really damn challenging. But yeah, the blueprints are all there, man. Steam tanks, chariots, doom wheels, the flyers we already have in Total War Warhammer, they all provide evidence that this can work, and it can work well. It just ain't gonna be easy. By the same token, melee is an extremely important aspect of 40k, and it's one of the things that will translate best to Total War. I'd argue it's just as important as ranged combat. Entire Chaos Legions, like the World Eaters, rely on their chainswords, their chain axes, their jump pack troops, and overwhelming power in close quarters to strike fear into their enemies and break them quickly. Even shooty races like the Eldar and Necrons have entire units dedicated solely to melee combat. You've got Striking Scorpions and Howling Banshees, Lich Guard, Scarabs. Tons of the combat that makes 40k what it is all revolves around getting up close and personal with your enemy. And what could be more satisfying than watching Karn the Betrayer bound across a causeway to carve up some Imperial Guardsmen with the Gore Child? It's pretty epic stuff, man. It could make for a really cinematic and really truly incredible experience. Now, just a few minutes ago, we were talking about whether the campaign map should confine itself to a single planet, to a single solar system, or to a part of the galaxy at large. And something that has to be considered here, because it plays such an integral part of 40k, is space combat and space travel in general. If Battlefleet Gothic Armada has taught us anything, it's that 1, there is plenty of desire on the part of consumers for awesome space battles, and 2, it's a really important component of the setting. But here's the thing. For Total War Warhammer, we've seen an awesome trilogy blossom before our eyes, but quite a few missteps, delays, and frustrations developed along the way. Can you imagine where that game would be right now if CA had tried to implement a full naval battle system with high elf dragon ships and dwarf ironclads, black arcs, sea monsters, Bretonnian galleons, and ships like the Swordfish and Bloody Reaver, alongside stuff like floating lizardmen turtles the size of cities? I shudder to think what we might have missed out on if they had tried to make all of that work. Unfortunately, I think the same principle applies here, and arguably even more so. Yes, it's an integral part of the 40k universe. Yes, it deserves to be in the game, but there has never been a bigger leap in technology and combat than the leap to 40k. For the same reason that I'm okay with not doing naval battles in fantasy, I'm okay with not doing space combat in the 41st millennium, at least initially. CA have to nail so many unique and dramatically different elements they've never tackled before. Ground-based combat in a universe with Leman Russ tanks, and Imperial Knights, and Wraith Lords, and Grav transports. Dealing with all of that new stuff and space battles just is not going to happen, at least on launch. So realistically, I think they would have to forgo space combat, possible IP issues colliding with the Gothic Armada devs notwithstanding, and focus on what Total War has always done best: land battles themselves. But I've got to say, if Creative Assembly are going to go down this road, they need a new engine. It's beyond debate at this point. What they've done with combat in Total War Warhammer is a miracle. It's breathed new life into the series. It honestly bears little resemblance to the combat we have in historical games. And I think from an impact and collision perspective, just the general sense of brutality and meatiness, they're the best battles in the series. So using that as a starting point is great. But the historical games have been using that same framework since Empire Total War, more than a decade ago, and it shows, and it's simply not going to cut it anymore. They need to invest heavily in fixing the issues present in the TW3 engine and allow for the addition of everything else that comes with the 40k license. And that is not going to be an easy or cheap thing to do. It might be the biggest hurdle they have to face should they choose to make this game, but it needs to happen. The benefit they have is, and perhaps this was even intentionally done by the devs in preparation for what comes after the end of Total War Warhammer, there are a ton of features and mechanics that will make a seamless transition to the science fantasy of the Milky Way galaxy. Psykers are almost a one-to-one translation of spellcasters in fantasy, in terms of their practical application on the battlefield. Shooting lightning from their mind, summoning tentacles from the warp, causing explosions to rip apart enemy formations from the inside, demonic summoning, it all works. It's already there. Demons of Chaos and Greenskins, their faces and models will already be available for use in 40k come the end of the Warhammer Fantasy Trilogy. Feral Cold Ones are literally, when you summon them as the Lizardmen, it's literally a deep strike. For Assault Squad drop pods or Terminator teleportation behind enemy lines, it's literally the exact same mechanic. Black Arc bombardments function the exact same way as an orbital bombardment would. We already have wildly different unit sizes in Total War Warhammer. A Guardsman regiment could have 160 or 200 models in a unit, while a Space Marine unit would function in maybe groups of 30. Terminators would be in groups of 12, like Monstrous Infantry, and Dreadnoughts, Imperial Knights, Wraith Lords, Titans, Gargants, and Chaos Helldrakes would all be single entities. And while absolutely massive, larger than anything in the history of the series, most, if not all, would all fit relatively easily on the battlefields of a Total War game. And while concessions would have to be made regarding the firepower and damage output of these world-ending weapons, and it would never be truly possible to accurately reflect every element of 40k combat according to the lore, the framework is there, and it totally could work. Again, I would like you all to join me in a moment of solidarity here. Close your eyes and imagine, feel the magic, Vegas on acid, seen through your St. Laurent glasses, and just picture how sick a trilogy of 40k games would be, seeing the full might of each important Space Marine chapter. The Necron tier, the Tau, Phaelbadon and the Black Legion, the Thousand Sons led by Magnus the Demon Prince of Tzeentch, Death Guard and the Death Shroud led by Mortarion, the Phoenix Lords of the Eldari, Maugan Ra, Jane Zar, the Storm of Silence, hell, maybe even the return of Korax, and the Khan from the Warp. All of them, legendary lords in their own right, with unique mechanics and playstyles in a galaxy-spanning campaign map. There is almost an infinite amount of content and inspiration to draw from, and it's the kind of series that could fund Creative Assembly for a decade or longer. I think, without question, if it was done well, it would blow every other Total War game out of the water in terms of sales and revenue, and has the potential to be one of the greatest strategy games of all time. No one does large-scale, real-time battles like the Total War series. I have doubts and reservations, but I think they'd be more than up to the task if they decided to tackle it. That is kind of the rub, though. At the end of the day, I have no idea if they're going to. I don't know if they have the manpower, the will, the desire, the fact that they're kind of spread out like that. They seem a little bit stretched right now. I don't know if they have the willpower to tackle a sci-fi fantasy game that is such a departure from anything they've ever done before. But all I can say is, please do it. And bless the masses with the primordial truth, the light of the Emperor, the gifts of Azurian, and the shards of the Chitan. We'll be doing a lot more 40k content very soon. Let me know what you think about the idea of a 40k Total War game, and if you think it would be possible, and what mechanics you would like to see implemented, which factions you'd like to see on day one. And I will see you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.